90s gaming was a period where two genres reigned supreme. The first-person shooters with games like Doom, Duke Nukem, Shadow Warrior,
Oh, look, you're coming apart.
Blood, Quake, and a bunch of other big and small titles. The other genre that was equally popular at the time was the RTS. There was a significant number of real-time strategy games that came out at the time and that tried to innovate, that tried to improve on the foundations set by the games that came before them, and that tried to bring something new to the table. One game dared to try to find a new path, set in a fantasy alternative history universe. Gone is the traditional resource gathering, gone is the simplistic diplomacy system of other RTSs, gone are the annoying priests that would wololo your entire army, and gone is unit variety to some degree. Developed by Enlight Software and published by Interactive Magic on the 30th of November 1997, this is the world of Seven Kingdoms Ancient Adversaries. In this review, we will be taking an in-depth look at the game's numerous complex mechanics, its positives and its negatives, in order for us to answer one question. Despite its age and despite its dated graphics, after all this time, is this game still worth playing for nostalgic and newer players alike? Let's see. Even before a simple skirmish match starts, you are given a bunch of different choices that let you tailor the experience to your liking, the game having 4 tabs of options that you can tinker around with. The first tab is something you see in any game in the genre. You can choose your civilization, how many opponents you face off against, land to water report, map type, and a couple of other things. Then we have the second tab, which might be found in some games. This lets you modify the treasury, the AI aggressiveness, fog of war, map revealed or not, and then we have the standout options for the Frythans. The third tab allows us to modify the number of resources nearby, independent villages, resistance, new villages, new kingdoms, random events, a lot of interesting and bizarre stuff for the uninitiated. Finally, the fourth tab lets us modify the victory conditions, there being some pretty good choices here. Things such as achieving certain economic or population scores, time caps, killing all the Frythans, and of course defeating all other kingdoms. The classic RTS formula of starting with a base, a couple of workers, and having resources nearby is something I think everyone is familiar with, be it from titles like Age of Empires or StarCraft. Other titles did things a bit different and started with a mobile base that you could deploy wherever you wanted, such as the Command & Conquer series or Crush, Kill and Destroy. Well, Seven Kingdoms does things a bit differently. Once you start your first match of Seven Kingdoms, you might see a couple of somewhat familiar elements, but then the uncertainty starts to creep in. You are given control of 2 things, a fort and a village. The village has a population of 40 peasants, loyalty 100. It is linked to the fort and we have 4 buttons at the bottom. In the wooden citadel we have the king who has a leadership of 100. These are all important elements that we'll talk about, but first let's start building our empire. In Seven Kingdoms, you have no units at the start and instead have to train specialists. However, training has a cost attached to it. In order to set up the various buildings your kingdom might need, you have to train a peasant and the skill of construction, as only construction workers can create any building. Other skills give access to profession-specific buildings. For example, mining allows a unit to build a mine, manufacturing allows a citizen to construct a factory or a war factory, and leadership allows soldiers to build forts. As I've mentioned, at the start of the match we are given control of a village that has a population of 40. Population is actually an extremely important resource. You want to train a builder? That's 1 less peasant in the village. You want to train a soldier? That's 1 less peasant in the village. You construct a mine? It has a maximum and optimal number of 8 workers. The same applies for the factory, Tower of Science, and War Factory. Likewise, the fort can also house 8 soldiers for training. Correctly managing your starting population can lead you to victory or defeat. Now, the number of villagers does increase over time passively, even though there are no women in the game, but this can be a very slow process. Oh, and by the way, peasants, the villagers that are not employed or trained, have a very important role that I'll talk about later. Depending on your style, you can immediately use your starting population to train soldiers and try to go on the offensive. However, this can have a damaging effect on your economy, and if your economy is too weak, you can lose. Another strategy might be to heavily focus on the economy. Build a mine, factory, market, create a new village, move villagers to another resource and set up a town there. However, this will probably mean you are defenseless. And obviously, you can go for something in the middle, preparing an army while also somewhat more slowly improving the economy. Each approach has its advantages and disadvantages. I will admit that I prefer to go for a good economy at the start as opposed to a strong military, which again has some downsides and it has its upsides. After understanding the game and its mechanics, if you go for a strong economy, which in my view means at the start operating free mines, the first few minutes during which you set up your kingdom are exciting as you have a lot of things to do. Train, build, scout out the map, see if there are more resources nearby, plan out your cities, possible trade routes, move villagers if needed, and move your king if needed. Well, after this setup is done, you will have quite some time before your economy becomes solvent if you start off with low funds. This means that for a while, there is nothing for you to do. Financially, you can't afford to do anything, and if you do, you'll be bankrupt. Depending on how lucky or unlucky you get with the resources and independent villages locations, you won't have any population that you can train in any skill, as you'll have to move people around. Likewise, you won't have a military. This means you can't train your soldiers. Training that improves their skill, and skill is immensely important. Furthermore, it also means you won't have an army that you can use to take over other villages and expand that way, or defend yourself if need be. This means all you can do is to watch the caravans travel on their trade routes and look at the debt slowly decrease. I've mentioned bankruptcy, so what happens if you run out of gold? Simple, people will betray you, as loyalty is a very important mechanic that we'll discuss quite soon. In short, while you don't get a game lost message, the game giving you a chance to try to recover, you more or less lose the match. If you survive the initial downtime and you manage it correctly, you won't have to worry about the economy until your mines run out of resources, which is a significant amount of time into a match. As soon as you start getting some money in, be it from export of goods or internal trade, you can start focusing on the military expansion of your kingdom. And since money is not something you really have to think about, after a short time, you can very rapidly expand. The pace of the game can vary greatly depending on your playstyle. The way I play results in a couple of times during a match where more or less I just manage the economy and nothing else. However, this gives me the financial stability to create a grand army for the late game. That being said, if you want a lot of action, you can get it by expanding your empire via the use of your armies, which is an interesting balancing act as you have to make sure not to overextend financially and militarily while continuously training soldiers and managing your population. If you choose to start with a resource nearby, you will have a random resource close to your starting village. Using a builder, you can construct a mine over the resource to start exploiting it. But what's interesting is that line that shows a link between the future mine and your village. In order for most buildings, mines, factories, war factories, and towers of science to operate, they need workers. And workers only live in villages. Makes sense, right? So, building something without a link to a village will result in an unusable building that still has a maintenance cost. As a result, positioning your buildings correctly can be quite important. Some resources on the map don't have a village nearby. Does this mean that those resources cannot be used? No, because you can just remove peasants from one of your villages, also known as recruiting, and have them create a new village near the resource or wherever else you want. Moving people from one village to another or establishing new villages is essential at the start when you're looking to expand or to take control of as many resources as possible. Just be careful with how many people you recruit at one time, as loyalty decreases whenever you remove someone from that village. Again, we'll talk about loyalty very soon. A very cool and useful feature is that if a village has a link to another village, you can move people from one place to another. So let's say there's an independent village somewhat close to a resource, but not close enough for a connection between the village and a mine to be created. In this case, you would first take control of the independent village. We'll talk about these types of villages later. Second, you would establish a new village that works as a bridge between the independent village and the mine. Then, move everyone from the newly acquired settlement to the bridge village. Following this step, you would create the permanent village, the one that is linked to the mine. Finally, you move all the people from the bridge village to the one that is linked to the mine, thus providing the mine and any other buildings with enough workers. Okay, so for a building to work, it needs a link to a village. Then what does the connection to the fort do? Does it train soldiers? No. And yes, the fort that initially houses your king can be used to train soldiers, but more importantly, it maintains control over the village, upholding and increasing loyalty. Loyalty is one of the most important mechanics in the game. If the loyalty of a village drops to a certain point, it can betray you and join another kingdom if an opponent has a fort linked to your settlement. An unsatisfied village can also revolt, at which point the dissatisfied villagers will take up arms against you, sometimes taking control of the village, other times killing everyone in it.
I would stay inside and hide just now, sire.
Loyalty can be increased and decreased by several factors. You can increase loyalty by giving people money. Who doesn't like free money? It's also influenced by a king's or general's leadership skill. With a leadership of 100, the king has no problem exerting his influence over a village, but a general with only 20 leadership will find it a bit more difficult, especially if he's of a different nationality than that of the villagers, since nationality is actually a factor. Villagers usually prefer the influence of a leader that's of the same nationality as them. A Viking general with only 20 leadership might find it difficult or impossible to control a Norman village. This means that it's better to use a Norman general to influence a village filled with Normans, even if he has a lower leadership skill than, let's say, a Viking general. That being said, generals with a very high leadership skill can in most cases influence any village regardless of nationality. They're just that good and rare. The thing is, it's nice to have a loyalty of 100, it means there is no chance of a revolt, but you don't need it that high, which means you'll actually want to lower it. Why? Because one sure way to get some money into your coffers is by taxing people. One of the 4 buttons on the village screen is the Collect Taxes button. If you ever need some additional cash or need to get out of debt, everyday citizens can help out by giving out a little bit of their earnings to you. I mean, the state. As one might expect, people aren't very happy to pay taxes, so whenever you push the Gather Taxes button, their loyalty will decrease. So try to make sure not to push that button too often, otherwise the people will revolt. 60 loyalty is a safe number.
Collecting taxes from these hard-working people almost brings a tear to my eye. But not quite.
After you expand your kingdom, it might become quite tedious and annoying to manually collect taxes. But don't worry, as the game has a very nice quality of life feature, which is the automated collect taxes option that will activate at certain loyalty thresholds. Loyalty can also be lowered by spies. Infiltrating a rival's kingdom will allow you to sow dissent, but we'll talk about spies later. Since we're on the topic of loyalty, all your units, except the king, have loyalty, and once the unit's loyalty hits a low enough threshold, they will betray you. There is no need to worry that much. A unit's loyalty increases once they're inside a village that's influenced by a leader, and in the case of soldiers, inside a fort, or, if you can afford it, by granting them honors. I mentioned that the fort does indeed train soldiers, but it's a more complex system than something like StarCraft, where you push a button and the unit appears after a time. Unlike Age of Empires or StarCraft, where units can be improved via various upgrades, in Seven Kingdoms, skill increases a unit's proficiency in combat, but we'll talk about skill in a separate chapter. All your units can fight, but just like SCVs, they're not very good at it. Soldiers can be trained from the village and they start off with a combat skill of 20 and leadership 20. However, this has a cost of 30 gold per unit. You can also just recruit people or kick them out of the village and send them in the fort so they can become soldiers. Kicking people out of the village has one positive and 2 negative aspects. The positive is there is no financial cost. You kick someone out and then send them into whatever building you want, or as I previously mentioned, send them to create a new village or move into an already existing one. The negative of recruiting someone like this is that while there is no monetary cost, there is a loyalty cost, again as I mentioned in the Links and Villages chapter of this review. The second negative aspect is that they will have a lower skill. Recruits start out with 10 combat skill and 10 whatever else. Send them in a mine and it's 10 mining. A Tower of Science, 10 Research, or a Fort, 10 Leadership. So at the start of the game when money is tight or during a financially difficult moment, you might want to simply kick some peasants off their land and send them where you need them. I do advise that you do not promote soldiers that are obtained this way to the rank of general, as they're not very good at that job. Combat in Seven Kingdoms is a little rough. It's not really a highlight of the game. The first thing to mention is that all civilizations basically only have a single unit. Granted, that unit for the most part has unique abilities depending on its civilization. These abilities are unlocked at certain combat levels, but we'll talk about that quite soon. You can have a more varied army if you have different nationalities in your villages and then train some of these people in the art of combat. That being said, even then, you will not have the same unit variety you might have in Age of Empires. There are no dedicated archers. Some nationalities can use ranged weapons at certain levels: the Normans, the Chinese, the Persians, and others. However, once they're engaged in a melee fight, they will automatically switch to their swords or spears. In Seven Kingdoms, there is no cavalry of any kind, and I will admit that this one is kind of rough for me, as I love cavalry in historic games. Then there are the fights themselves, which are rather chaotic and sometimes very difficult to control, as you'll have a screen filled with units. Yours, theirs, shooting, fighting, caravans just minding their own business, trying to reach a market and going straight through the middle of the battlefield. It can be difficult to attack specific units due to how many there are and how tightly packed the fights can be. Units might also stop attacking a target you want and in exchange go for the nearest enemy. You can change the alert mode of units, which makes them no longer attack anything you don't tell them to, but the drawback is they will no longer respond unless they are directly attacked. So if you're fighting on multiple fronts, your units will basically be defenseless. The last thing to mention is that there are no defensive buildings in Seven Kingdoms. No towers, no walls, no gates, no castles that can be garrisoned and that open fire on attacking enemies, nothing. One way to supplement your unit types is by creating war machines, such as ballistas, catapults, cannons, and a couple of other things. Once deployed on the battlefield, these things are great, dealing some pretty heavy damage to infantry and buildings alike. There's just one problem. You can build a war factory right off the bat at the start of the match, but you won't be able to create anything, as you first need to research the technology that unlocks that machine. In theory, this sounds great. It gives you a military avenue to pursue should you choose to. You also have to invest time into discovering these machines, and it's pretty realistic. However, in practical terms, this is a very slow process. Researching a technology takes way too long because your initial researchers will have a meager 10 research. And even if you discover the technology, you're still going to have to build the war machine, which is also a lengthy process because manufacturing skill only increases when people work on stuff. So your war manufacturers will have a low skill for the majority of the match. On the other hand, if you have multiple towers of science with highly trained researchers, discovering new technologies is a joke, because they get the job done too fast, which reveals another issue. There are not a lot of technologies to discover, and they're not very diverse. The technologies that we can discover only comprising of a couple of war machines and ships. There is nothing to improve the health of some or all units, the damage, the shield block chance, unlock additional abilities, unit types, or buildings. It seems that highly skilled researchers can discover new technologies quicker. So what does skill do for other professions? For miners and manufacturers, skill increases their efficiency in that certain field. For soldiers, skill increases their hit point total and unlocks additional abilities at certain thresholds. Norman soldiers start out with a sword and a shield. However, they gain the ability to use that shield at combat level 30, and at level 50 they can start using a crossbow. Different nationalities have their own abilities unlocked at certain levels. For example, the Japanese will be able to critically strike an enemy at level 55. The Greeks, on the other hand, get no additional abilities, except for the fact that their attack speed increases, which makes them unbelievably good in melee combat. You might be wondering, how is skill gained? Simple, by having that unit participate in whatever activity. The factory worker's manufacturing skill increases passively over time just by refining whatever raw material is sent to that factory. The same goes for the miners and the researchers. Soldiers have two ways of building up combat skill. They can either be garrisoned in a fort with the king or a general, and the combat ability will increase passively over time. I would also like to mention that during the training of the soldiers in the fort, the general's leadership skill also increases passively over time. Leadership influences the time required to train a soldier, so the higher the general's leadership skill, the quicker you get a high quality army. Fighters can also improve their combat skill by participating in combat. Yeah, the more your soldiers fight, the better they are at fighting. A highly trained unit can sometimes be worth 2, 3, or even 4 untrained soldiers. That being said, even leveled out soldiers can die, and if they are overwhelmed by wave after wave of enemies, they will certainly die. Quality can be quite impactful, and in some cases it allows you to win wars. However, the same thing can be said about numbers. If you can stomach heavy casualties and have a significant population, you can certainly use that to your advantage and defeat your enemies. There is one last, incredibly expensive way you can get specialists or highly trained units: the Inn. This building has a random rotating crew of mercenaries of various nationalities that you can hire at some extremely high prices. I find this building quite useful when I have a lot of money and I want to get a high leadership soldier of a different nationality than that of my empire so that I can transform him into a general and influence an independent village of that nationality. Soldiers, factories, workers, generals, forts, specialists, all of these sound extremely expensive, especially since all units and buildings have an upkeep cost. And yes, it is very expensive. So how do you earn the money to pay for all of these things? Just by collecting taxes? No, just collecting taxes is not a solution. It's important, but you need trade. Usually, at the start you would have a resource nearby. You would then train a builder, create a mine, then a factory, followed by a market that is linked to the factory in order for the market to receive the finished goods that are produced at said factory and that is connected to a village so that there are actual clients for those goods. You can create caravans, each one requiring a population of 10, and establish a trade route to a maximum of 2 markets. These can be your markets or another kingdom's markets. This is how you will make most of your gold. The more resources you exploit and the more villages with markets you have, the more money you will make. This is why I said that at the start I like to build free mines, as it seems like free is the maximum you can build without completely tanking your economy. Once I set up those mines and start establishing trade routes between my villages, the money starts to flow in. It's important to mention that the resources are finite. After some time, your mines will be exhausted, and new resources will spawn in random locations on the map. The more the match continues, the more you will have to chase these resources, as you can win the game by economically choking out your adversaries. Honestly, it's close to, if not absolutely impossible, to take control of all the resources on the map at the start. This means your adversaries will also have some pretty good economies, the AI never seeming to mismanage this part of the game. As a result, your adversaries will grow in size. However, if you manage to take control of most or all the resources after the first mines are exhausted, their economies will slowly fade, leaving them with too many things, too many soldiers, buildings, war machines, spies, etc. Leaving your opponents without resources can lead to their complete collapse. And I do have to say that it's quite funny seeing your opponents start to sell off buildings in order to survive. Granted, in most cases they will go to war with you in an attempt to gain access to some resources. However, if you take your time and just build up your forces, you will manage to smash their desperate attempts. Furthermore, if you hold on to your gold, you can just buy out your rivals' kingdoms. Technically, it is possible to win a match and never go to war, though this is exceedingly rare. In one match, I thought it would be a great idea to start training some soldiers right away and fill my first fort, build a couple of mines really quickly, move peasants to the new mines, build factories, build markets, and then I'll have a great economy. Turns out, I was right. I had enough money to build quite a couple of forts and fill them up with soldiers so that I could go on the offensive and take out my rivals. However, I didn't take into account another extremely important factor when it comes to this game: food. It turns out that forcefully industrializing my nation by kicking peasants off their farms and putting them to work in factories is not such a good idea. Who could have guessed? When I realized that I was going to run out of food, I tried buying some from another kingdom, and luckily they had food to sell. I say luckily because, as it turns out, people don't tend to stay loyal when their stomachs are empty, and they will quickly look for a new employer. And this is exactly what happened when I ran out of the food I just bought. The question then has to be, how do you grow food? Well, you don't. This is not Age of Empires. You can't just build more farms. Food is actually generated passively by peasants. So the more peasants you have in a village, the more food they produce. Each peasant will produce 30 units of food per year, and each subject of your kingdom will consume 10 units per year. Thus, to maintain a sufficient food supply, you must have at least one peasant for every 3 subjects. This is what I really like about this game. It's a real-time strategy game, but you don't really have to directly manage your economy. In a sense, Seven Kingdoms is more similar to something like Caesar or Civilization than Age of Empires.
You can get more of what you want with a kind word and a gun than you can with just a kind word.
Here you have to balance your economy. You're constantly asking yourself, do I have enough food and money to build more soldiers? Should I try to build a mine here, despite the fact that there's no nearby village? You might not have to micromanage your kingdom, but you will have to make decisions constantly throughout the entire match. And again, I have to mention this, a strong economy can be used to buy out enemy kingdoms, which is absolutely amazing. There is one element that you can choose to engage with or not, that is, the diplomacy. While not fully mandatory, if you want to eliminate all your opponents, there are some cool options in the Diplomacy tab. Not only can you declare war, make alliances, but you can reach trade agreements, purchase food, ask for financial aid, demand tribute, or another kingdom's most recent technology, plus a couple of other things. The cool part about the Diplomacy is that there are consequences. Refusing to offer aid to an ally during their war, well, they might just cancel your alliance. Refusing to pay tribute to the kingdom that has the biggest military, they might just declare war on you. Paying tribute, well, that kingdom might just offer an alliance. Furthermore, a high reputation for your kingdom will help increase the loyalty level of all villagers. Diplomacy is far from perfect, but it is a lot more complex than what you see in many other RTSs, especially for the time. If you manage to keep a balance between all the other kingdoms' demands by using diplomacy and you use spies, you can have a very interesting match. I've talked about loyalty, but I forgot to mention that your rivals are also affected by this mechanic, which means that you can play that to your advantage since one of the specialists you can recruit is the spy. You can send spies to infiltrate any aspect of an enemy's kingdom. You want to sabotage their industry, send a spy in their factory or their mine. Don't really know what you want to infiltrate? Just send them in their village and let the AI send a spy wherever it wants, including the fort. That's when the fun begins. Spies, in addition to leveling up whatever profession skill they receive as part of their job, combat for soldiers, research in the Tower of Science, etc., they also level up their spy skill, which allows them to assassinate generals or kings when in a fort. Spies can also bribe generals, and if successful, that general becomes a spy for your kingdom, and he can take control of the fort when you choose to, which will instantly make all the soldiers inside join your kingdom. If the bribe attempt is unsuccessful, however, well, your spy meets a nasty end, and you lose all the gold. Don't think it's all fun and daggers when it comes to the spies, because your kingdom can also be infiltrated. Actually, I guarantee that your rivals will send spies in your villages, buildings, and they will try to enter your forts. If a random peasant wants to join your kingdom, you might want to be cautious and not send them in the fort where your king is. Let me give you a tip. From what I've observed, the AI loves to send spies to infiltrate a fort where the roster isn't full. So, if you get the message that whoever has joined your side and is heading towards a fort, select that unit, press delete and kill it. You'll thank me later. You can also use spies to root out enemy infiltrators by having them garrisoned inside your buildings or your villages, where they perform counter-espionage, which is why I always have one spy in all my forts. The last thing to mention about spies is that they can infiltrate independent villages and lower their resistance. What does that mean? Well, it means it makes it easier for you to take control of these villages. Throughout the map, you will see a bunch of villages that have no liege. This means that anyone can take control of them. However, don't think that this is an easy task, as people are reluctant to relinquish their independence and they will try to resist you. Why would you want to take control of these independent villages in the first place? Well, there are actually quite a few reasons. First of all, remember that population is important for different reasons. Peasants grow food. More people means more people you can tax or train to become soldiers. Secondly, different nationalities have different abilities in combat, so you might want an army comprised of units that can use ranged weapons like the Normans, Persians, or Zulus, combined with good melee units like the Greeks, Japanese, or Vikings. Finally, beyond the taxes, if you build a market that is linked to that village and create trade routes, it means more customers for your goods, which means more money. The first thing you want to do when taking over one of these villages is to build a fort that is linked to that village. Then garrison a general that has the same nationality as the villagers, as that will lower resistance faster. Additionally, the higher the leadership of the general, the faster you can win over your target. When a village is at below 50 resistance, the people there are starting to warm up to the idea of joining your kingdom and will start getting jobs in your buildings. This will also hasten the surrender of the village. Sometimes villages have different nationalities, and these ones can be a bit more tricky to take over. Here is a village comprised of Normans, Mayas, and Greeks. My general is Norman, and the Norman and Maya population's resistance is slowly decreasing, but the Greeks are having none of it. I could try to construct another fort and bring in a Greek general, but that can take a lot of time. I could try showering them with money and win them over that way, but that is extremely expensive. Or I could just attack the village. The problem with this method is that you will kill some of the villagers, lowering the population, and you want more people joining your kingdom, not less. Oh, and if you do decide to attack the village and have a spy in it, make sure to first evacuate the spy, otherwise there is a pretty good chance you will kill your own guy. Occasionally, random independent units, also known as rebels, of various professions will join your kingdom, convinced of your future glory, or maybe wanting a bigger paycheck. These reformed rebels can vary not just in profession, but in skill. Sometimes, rebels being highly skilled units, and if one such unit joins you close to the start of the game and happens to be a high leadership soldier, it feels like winning the lottery, because leadership is a very hard skill to improve. There's just one small issue. That rebel, that so-called independent unit, might actually be an enemy spy looking for a way to infiltrate your kingdom and either kill or bribe your generals, so be careful. Alongside independent villages on the world map, you will also spot Frythan layers. Frythans are monsters. This is one of my favorite aspects of the game. In Civilization, for example, you can play as Julius Caesar and go against Gandhi and Roosevelt, which is a fun element, a what-if of history. Well, in Seven Kingdoms, you're basically doing the same by playing historic civilizations, but you then add monsters to the mix. And we have a pretty good mix of monsters: skeletons, lizard people, rock people, doinks, and a bunch of other things. These creatures aren't here just for show, they can also provide treasure after killing the Ordo, or the Frythans general, and most importantly, the Ancient Scroll of Power, which gives you access to the Greater Beings. The Greater Being is the supreme unit of a civilization, and they vary depending on nationality. For example, the Chinese have a dragon that can set enemies on fire. So do the Normans, but it's a more European-style dragon. The Egyptians have Isis, who can increase population in a town, and the Japanese have the Mind Turner, which can, as his name implies, make enemies switch sides by decreasing their loyalty. What I really love about these creatures is that they make me curious about what in God's name is going on here. Why are there suddenly monsters mixed in with real historical peoples? Whenever I think about the game's world and what could have happened, I always picture something like the disjunction from Lionheart, Legacy of the Crusader, where benevolent and malevolent spirits break out in the real world. The game's manual provides no answers as to why these beings exist. However, I think something terrible happened to the world. I don't know what, but something terrible. I know we're pretty late in the review to talk about story, immersion, and aesthetics. However, I wanted to get the mechanics of the game out of the way first and explain how the game works before I covered these topics. I want two things from a game: a good narrative.
I am Andrew Ryan, and I'm here to ask you a question. Is a man not entitled to the sweat of his brow? No, says the man in Washington, it belongs to the poor. No, says the man in the Vatican, it belongs to God. No, says the man in Moscow, it belongs to everyone. I rejected those answers. Instead, I chose something different.
and good combat, or gameplay if it's not that type of game. Obviously, I prefer if a game has a great many other things, but overall I am pleased with a game that has either of those two things. Ideally, both. Unfortunately, Seven Kingdoms combat is not that good. Furthermore, it has no story, no characters, and no campaign where it could weave a narrative. It is up to you to make up these things. You have to imagine how your king and generals and soldiers and peasants interact with one another and what intrigues might arise. You have to imagine how your spies get their information, how they infiltrate rival kingdoms, or the aftermath of an assassination attempt. Obviously, story can be a bit tricky to do in RTSs.
This is the Pentagon. A full frontal attack with your strongest forces should render their military center of operation.
Yes. Power shifts more quickly than some people think. I am Kane. While I get your troops back from the States, I want you to take what men you have left and secure this abandoned GDI base. Once in, build up an arsenal of weapons and use them to wipe out the remaining GDI presence. Oh, and congratulations on your promotion.
Though there are clear examples of how to handle this aspect in a genre where story is not a very important element. Sadly, in the story department, I have to give Seven Kingdoms a failing grade. One of my favorite elements when it comes to games is the immersion. Can I get lost in the world that the game proposes? Does this world even stand out in any way? Was any thought put into it? Are the rules that the universe sets up consistent? These are just some questions I have when looking at a game. So how does Seven Kingdoms stack up in the immersion category? Honestly, I find the game pretty immersive, even though this is not a RPG or any kind of story-driven game. I can't say that I like the universe Seven Kingdoms proposes as much as I do Lionheart Legacy of the Crusaders, even though they are both alternative history fantasy universes, but I still like Seven Kingdoms world. Whenever I play this game, I am still invested in my kingdom. I am interested in the well-being of my subjects and how to develop my kingdom. I get upset when an old general gets assassinated, and I always get a bit paranoid when I see a rebel joining my empire. So to me, Seven Kingdoms is a surprisingly captivating and immersive game. I also think that the aesthetics help. Seven Kingdoms is not the best looking of games, however I do like the style. I don't know why, but I like the cartoony, stylized look of units, buildings, and of course that of the Frythans and greater beings. Even the images in the encyclopedia are nice. Obviously, everything is dated. I mean, we are talking about a game that came out in 97 or 98, so it's to be expected. That being said, I adore the way the standard or the grass maps and the snow maps look. The vibrant green grass really stands out. The snow maps also look and feel great. Granted, they could have really used a bit more nature, some more forests, maybe an animal here and there, or maybe some ruins of an old, forgotten civilization to make the world feel more alive. But I like what they were going for. On the other hand, I kind of hate the Badlands. Those maps look miserable, muddy, and there's nothing that stands out about them. I know we're talking about Badlands, but they still needed something that made them pop out more. The last thing to mention about Seven Kingdoms is that it has some pretty good tutorial maps where you learn the basics of the game. Seven Kingdoms, despite not having a campaign, has scenarios. These range from simple and fun to soul-crushingly brutal. In essence, they behave like the skirmish mode where you have a bunch of different conditions. Things such as achieving an economic score in a certain amount of time, or eliminate all opponents while only starting with the king and 7 highly trained soldiers but no village. And all independent villages have a very high resistance. From what I've observed completing some of these scenarios, they can be finished in different ways, giving you the ability to play more accordingly to your style. When it comes to these old games, I often wonder how was the game received back in the day. After a bit of digging to see what I can find, here are a couple of quotes from some reviews somewhat close to the game's release. Gamespot, 1st of May 2000. Seven Kingdoms is quite a surprising find amid the rubble of real-time strategy games. It almost passes by unnoticed, thrown in the pile with a couple dozen similar games. Seven Kingdoms delivers on the promises made by Age of Empires by creating a real-time meld of civilization-type empire building and Warcraft-style combat, with enough unique twists to make it more than a mere hybrid. It is one of the best strategy games of the year and deserves more attention than it is liable to get. The quietly released title from Interactive Magic is a sophisticated, attractive, intelligent, and profound real-time game of economic and military conquest. Game Revolution, 5th of June 2004, in an article called A Seventh of Its Potential. When I first saw Seven Kingdoms, I was excited by its potential. Here was a real-time strategy game that reminded me both of Warcraft 2 and Civilization. It promised the ability to control research, diplomacy, espionage, production, racial tension, and trade, while providing an exciting and diverse real-time battle. All the ingredients for an excellent game were there. The only thing that was yet to be seen was if the designers could pull it all together into something fun to play. It seems that in trying to make all the elements of a game like Seven Kingdoms fit together, some compromises had to be made. The designers forgot to add a good variety of units or interactions with the environment, such as trees and animals. Despite some comparison to Civilization on the box, Seven Kingdoms is nowhere near as complex. As if to compensate for the depth of unit choices, the supernatural being God component helps spice up battles from time to time. The excellent espionage system makes Seven Kingdoms very entertaining for multiplayer, but for a single-player game, I'd recommend either Warcraft 2 or Age of Empires. PC Power Play Issue 21, publication date February 1998. Couple the comprehensive diplomacy with the importance of trade, and you finally have a strategy title that succeeds in placing these factors on par with military strength when it comes to winning the game. If you've been hankering after some real-time strategy that puts emphasis upon strategy as opposed to tactical combat, then I fully expect Seven Kingdoms to meet those requirements. Seven Kingdoms Ancient Adversaries is a standout RTS that did things differently. It has a lot of complex systems and mechanics that work well, an interesting approach to diplomacy and economy. It has a fascinating loyalty system that can create some fun moments, unless your most important general gets assassinated, which can be quite infuriating. It has a universe that makes me curious and want to learn more about it. It has a lot of ways you can customize a match, having options to pretty much change any aspect. However, it has very weak overall combat, it lacks unit, building, and technology variety, and there is no campaign or story of any kind. I think that despite all its flaws, yes, Seven Kingdoms Ancient Adversaries is still worth playing, and it can still provide hours of fun for both nostalgic and newer players. What do you think? Is Seven Kingdoms a forgotten gem or a game that deserves to be forgotten? Have you played this game? If so, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on Seven Kingdoms, so please let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching. I hope to see you next time. Have an awesome day.